All right, and we're back with another lesson of the law. I know we've run out of the 10 Commandments, but there's still laws out there to be discussed. And so this week's title is What's for Dinner? And originally I was looking up video ideas to open up with, one of them being the commercial steak. It's what's for dinner. But I couldn't find a good video that made too much sense. But I thought it was an interesting call, and kind of relevant too to the topic. But if it's not obvious already what the topic might be for this week, it is on biblical dietary laws. And you might be thinking, what's the point of really discussing this? Since, most of us just eat whatever we want. But it is in the Bible, so it must have a purpose. And it has a reason that it was at least written down at one point. And at the very least, you can say that you've learned something that's not actually that often taught at church. But of course, you got to go to Timothy. We've seen this verse a few times, but just as a reminder, all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instructions in righteousness. And I just as a general belief, I just have is anything God says probably has meaning behind it, had purpose, and that God had a reason, and it's good, no matter what it is. And so that's why I think this topic is still relevant today. So let's get to what was and wasn't allowed. Most of us know that there are things that were prohibited. And as I was looking at this lesson, I found this chart that really helps out, especially if you're in the wild, you're not sure what is and isn't clean. You can just kind of look at this chart. It has a nice little flow chart. Yes, no, yes, no. But for the birds of the air, it was more just, is it this or that? And is it an eagle, vulture, buzzard, kite, falcon, raven, ostrich, owl, seagull, hawk, jackdaw, stork, heron, a hoopoe, or a bat? If it's one of those specific birds, then it is not clean. It is not considered clean and should not be eaten. Other than that, pretty much every other bird was considered clean, at least by that. Also, I forgot to mention, all of this is in chapter 11 for the clean and unclean meats. Now, there are other things within the kosher, because that's kind of the term that is known by for the Jews, whether animal is clean or unclean. But you can find all of this in chapter 11 and a few passages elsewhere. Now, for insects, there was a question of, does it have 4 walking legs? Yes, no. And does it have jointed jumping legs? Yes, no. If it does have both of those, then it's clean. It's good to eat. If not, not so clean. Don't eat it. And so pretty much actually, there's only a couple bugs that you can eat. I think it would be considered crickets and grasshoppers. I think that's about it. Maybe locusts. But you kind of have to go based off of those two. And I'm not 100% certain of the anatomy of all the different types of bugs there are. But if it has those two, then it's clean. Now, another one is for land animals. Is the hoof split? Yes, no. Does it chew the cud? Yes, no. If it does, in both of these cases, like a cow, then it's considered clean. If not, like a pig, it is not considered clean. And lastly, for the last sect of animals, is fish, in a sense. Anything in the water. Does it have fins? And does it have scales? If it has yes for both of those, then it's clean. If not, like in the picture right here, there's an octopus, does not have fins, does not have scales. It is not considered clean. Now, there are other parts that weren't supposed to be eaten. Any animal strangled, what it was supposed to be killed humanely, draining the blood. So you're not supposed to eat strangled, and you're also not supposed to eat the blood, and you're supposed to kill it humanely. The method of slaughter is supposed to be quick, deep stroke across the throat with a perfectly sharp blade with no nicks or unevenness. This method is painless, causing unconsciousness within 2 seconds, and is widely recognized as the most humane method of slaughter possible. And if you're going into a deli or a place that actually is kosher meat, then they are also supposed to abide by that practice. They're not supposed to kill it inhumanely. Now, with this chart, you might be confused of what is and isn't because, as I said, we don't know animals' anatomy that well these days. So here's just a few. This is not an exhaustive list. This are just some. They're not even the best order, but with the birds, ones that you can eat is chicken, dove, duck, goose, pigeon, quail, and turkey. Those are all clean. Everything else on the left, not clean. For kosher, clean. For more land animals, antelope, buffalo, cow, deer, goat, locust, and sheep. Interestingly enough, on the other side, I felt like they kind of mixed this, but any amphibians, not supposed to eat, and bear. It never crossed my mind to even eat a bear, but it's on the list of not to eat. Horses, rabbits, even though that was kind of common for certain parts of the states. I think people do actually eat rabbits. No reptiles. You're not supposed to eat reptiles or rodents, snail, or squid. So for France, tough luck for snails. For fish, though, actually, Japan, as we were discussing in the classroom, that a lot of their stuff like eel and crab and, shrimp, oyster, there's a lot of stuff that Japan eats and on the non-kosher list. But there is still quite a lot on the right side. You can eat carp, anchovies, salmon, mackerel, a lot of fish. You got a lot to choose from over there. And as I'm saying, this is not exhaustive. There's quite a lot there. And so there's just a few other verses I wanted to bring up, saying Leviticus 7:26-27. Moreover, you shall not eat any blood in any of your dwellings, whether bird or beast. And so this is really strict rule of don't eat blood. And actually, we still don't do that. We know that drinking blood is kind of wrong. And really, it's very, in a sense, a pagan practice. It's considered a lot of times done in like satanic worship ceremonies or kind of whatever you call those. But they do that, drinking of animal blood. And so that's one of the reasons why forbidden for Jews and Christians. Deuteronomy, another passage, says, you shall not eat anything that dies of itself. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. So there's two things here. One, don't eat anything you find dead, in a sense. If you find an animal dead on the ground along your path, you're not supposed to be like, oh, look, there's dinner. No, that's very dangerous. You don't know why it died. It could have died because of a disease. It could have died because it was attacked from another animal who also could have been diseased. So there's a lot of health and hygiene reasons behind why you want to follow that rule. Now, in the second passage, well, it's actually the same passage, but second half of the verse, very interesting. If you talk to any Jew, they will tell you this verse means you should not eat meat and milk at the same time. Not supposed to do it. And they point to this verse. And to me, I just don't understand how they get that with this verse. It makes no sense. But this is what they point to because there's really nowhere else that speaks of not having milk and meat together. But for me, when I've read this verse, I interpret it that, one, literally, don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. I'm sure that was actually probably a pagan practice in one of the worship ceremonies of some pagan religion. And so I think there's that practice, but I think there's also a certain amount of age almost. You shouldn't eat an animal that's too young or not fully developed. And that's interesting, I think, because if you look at how we've offered the animals to God in the past, in the Old Testament, I think you're supposed to wait a year at the very least so it grows. So I think that is really what the verse is talking about, is not doing it too soon. You can't eat it. And that interesting delicacies, quote unquote delicacies, that you can buy of fertilized eggs, like turkey eggs or I think some other eggs that have a chicken or a bird's embryo in it, in a sense slightly developed, and that's supposed to be a meal you can eat. And to me, that just seems so wrong. You should not be doing that to me. I don't know. But I look at this verse and I think that is what it's kind of pertaining to, the age. You're eating too soon. It's not developed. There's a lot of things that could go wrong in a sense. But moving on, Leviticus 7:23-24, you shall not eat any fat of ox or sheep or goat, and the fat of an animal that dies naturally, and the fat of what is torn by the wild beast may be used in any other way, but you shall by no means eat it. So it's pretty interesting. It's telling us don't eat fat. It's not healthy. And it says you can use it literally any other way you want if you got fat lying around, from cooking all the meat. You got fat, you're not supposed to eat it. So there are actually other reasons to keep it around, because actually in the next verse, Leviticus 7:27-24, it says, and the priest shall burn them on the altar as food, an offering made by fire for a sweet aroma. All the fat is the Lord's. This shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings. You shall eat neither fat nor blood. This is just reiteration of the other verse, in a sense, and adding. But when you would offer an animal to God, they would specifically cut the fat off for an aroma, in a sense, a special offering, in a sense. So if it wasn't for that, so a lot of fat goes for that, but if you're just cooking at home and you're cutting your animal up, then there would be reason to dispose of the fat yourself or do some other things with it, as there are other, you can make soap, as I've heard you can do with fat, and other things like that. Now, all this being said, you might be curious, well, if I want to follow this dietary law, what am I looking for? Well, right here's some symbols. The most probably common ones you will recognize is the U. You'll find that mostly in America, I think. And I think I've seen the star and the one below the U. Those are the three that I've seen in America. I'm not sure about the other ones. But these are organizations that, go to the actual foods, different companies, and see how they're doing things, what they're putting in, and if they're doing everything correctly to their kosher diets. And so it's actually pretty easy to follow. You just look at anything. Found one online. Nutella. There it is. Example, there's the U. It's safe to eat by kosher law. So the question is, really, what are the different interpretations of these laws, in a sense? Because a lot of people argue, well, we don't have to follow it, or maybe we do. What would we do? So there is the views of we should adhere strictly to it. There are sects of Jews that follow it. Not so much in America today. The Jews in America are fairly whitewashed and Americanized, so they don't quite follow it, but there are still some Jews that do. Seventh-day Adventist, which is a Christian denomination, they do follow the kosher laws fairly strictly. Now, there's other ones that treat it symbolically. As I was preparing this lesson, I kind of remembered something I read from one of the apostolic fathers. They treated it very symbolically, very, very interesting. I actually found, let me see if I can find it. There's a passage in one of the writings. It says, accordingly, he mentioned the pig for this reason. You must not associate, he means, with such people who are like pigs. That is, when they are well off, they forget the Lord God. But when they are in need, they acknowledge the Lord, just as the pig ignores its owner when it is feeding. But when it is hungry, it starts to squeal and falls silent only after being fed again. Neither shall you eat the eagle or the hawk or the kite or the crow. Means associate with or even resemble such people who do not know how to provide food for themselves by labor and sweat, but lawless plunder other people's property. And so that's an example of another very symbolic taking to the law, where they just say, yeah, no, this wasn't meant to be interpreted literally. We can eat whatever we want. What it really means is this is a picture of people and we shouldn't be around, or like, in a sense, or similar. And I think it's a very interesting way to take it. And you could kind of say there's some merit there. Yeah, you shouldn't be like a pig, or you shouldn't be like the hawk. But you could, I see it more of just an analogy that you could come up with truth and pin it to anything almost. So I wouldn't quite say that's biblically accurate, though. But it's a very interesting concept. Now, another view is just to toss it out with the rest of the Mosaic Covenant. And I just put one example, which some argued, saying that, well, Moses spoke these laws and not God. Now, as we recall, one of the first verses we read was that all scripture is inspired by God, and it's all profitable in a sense. So it's in the Bible. God did speak it. It wasn't just Moses trying to create laws for himself. I'm not sure why someone would do that, and limit yourself different types of meat. But that is just one of the examples that people give for the Mosaic covenant not being relevant, and the list goes on for that one. But we all know that this whole series has been about the law, and that all of it has a purpose and a more spiritual or deeper meaning behind it, and not just necessarily the letter of the law, even though the letter of the law can be applied. And that's where I think the best part, or the best view to hold, is remember all scripture is profitable and it has a purpose. That's personally what I hold to, in a sense. I think the kosher laws do have merit and should be, in one regard at least, adhered to. Not necessarily super strictly, but you should try a little bit. But, it's not the end of the world if you don't. We'll see why or a little bit later. But I think because it has everything to do with hygiene. These laws aren't anything but hygiene and health. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So what was the purpose of the laws? As I'm kind of saying, the hygiene. So the dietary laws are designed as a call for self-control. One of the reasons I think God did say this is it causes self-control. Following any diet for a long period of time is difficult, and only very disciplined people are able to keep them. So I also believe it ingrains the idea of clean and unclean, the sacred and the profane. If you're considering even the things you're eating, which you do every day, of what is clean and unclean, you kind of get this different sense. And that's where I think a lot of people don't have that sense. They just put whatever they want in their mouth and eat, And so I think there's also health benefits also are there, since it prohibits many unhealthy meats such as pork, rats, birds of prey, shrimp, all of those. Just think about what they live in or what they eat themselves, not necessarily nutritious. Rats are very scavengers. They just kind of eat whatever. They're in the dirt a lot. Birds of prey, they eat, already dead animals, or they will, get other animals, and so they're eating other meat. Shrimp, other bottom-dwelling fish, they eat whatever's on the ground. And if you think about that, that is literally can be crap from the other fish from above. And so that's not necessarily a clean animal if you really think about what you want to be eating. And pork, that's just kind of given. It's actually on the type 1 carcinogenic list, up there with smoking, even though as I was researching this, they said, yes, it's in the type 1, but smoking obviously is of a different, is much more guaranteed you will get cancer than just eating pork. But it is still considered there's a correlation, and that's why they put it there. Now, I do believe there's also many unforeseen benefits that we are unaware of, but we just haven't found them yet, in a sense of science hasn't gotten there. As we know, science has proven many things that the Bible has prescribed for the Israelites to follow to be actually very healthy, like quarantining and bathing and burning contaminated clothes when someone gets a disease, in a sense. There's many laws that said, okay, someone gets a disease, put them outside the camp, make sure they take, when they think they're healed, take a bath, burn any of their clothes that, came in contact. It was all for the limiting of a disease. Now, they weren't necessarily told exactly all the scientific reasons and all this behind it is how it limits germs, because back then they didn't know about germs. And so God just said, you're going to have to believe me that what I say is true. And I think there's certain application for the kosher laws in a sense of God said something. I don't believe he just makes things up for no reason. And I think there's some application there. Now, there's other examples. And that's the thing, is a lot of these health and hygiene laws we actually still apply to today, like those ones in quarantining or human waste. There is laws on saying you needed to bury your restroom breaks, in a sense you could say, fecal matter, bury it outside the camp, far away from where people are. that is healthy. It makes sure that none of it is in very dense populations. That can be a bad thing. And actually, history is filled with epidemics linked to the careless dumping of human waste into streets and rivers. And we know that of England. England was just got real sick, and lots of bad things happened because of that. And those, if you've heard of like piss pots, that was a real thing. It's not something you just saw in movies or certain westerns or certain things that people would literally just, they go to the restroom in the house and then they chuck it out the window when they're done. That was a real thing. And when they figured out, oh look, that's why we're getting sick, we should stop that and develop an actual sewer structure, things got better. But if they just followed what the Bible said, they wouldn't have had to, figure that out the hard way. But many people died that way. Now, another one of these health laws, or I would say hygiene laws, that has obviously been debated a lot in the New Testament is the circumcision one. That is more around the concept of, does one need to become a Jew first and then become a Christian? That's really the argument within that one. But there is also the hygiene application of actual circumcision, that there's more, it's cleaner, I guess you could say, and that there's other health benefits to having that done. Now, obviously, the verses in the New Testament says, does this prevent you to becoming Christian? No, it doesn't. You can do whatever you want, in a sense, on that matter. It's not something that will cause any issues there. But if you're just thinking in a health conscious reason, it might be a good thing to be done if it's not already done already. And so you can kind of consider the kosher law kind of similar in that way. Now, I think there's one other reason that God may have put this for the Jews and the Israelites to follow, is it creates a distinction between the Jews and Gentiles, or culture. Because one of the most prevalent things about a culture, or the first things you think about, is the food they eat. If I say Mexican or Chinese food, you already know what I'm talking about. You're not like, oh, are you talking about hamburger? No, obviously not. So it's kind of this cultural thing. And there's nothing wrong with having a culture, except this one, the Jewish culture was instructed by God. And so I think there's some interesting things there. Now, there's another verse that I felt interesting, was in Genesis 7:2. You shall take with you 7 of every clean animal, a male and his female, to each animals that are unclean, a male and his female. So, if you know where this is in context, it should be perking up your ears. You'd be like, that's very interesting. Genesis 7, that's about the time of Noah. And you'd be right. This is actually right before Noah gets on the ark and God's saying, get some clean animal and unclean animals. Which brings up the question, well, wait a second. Animals weren't divided into clean and unclean at the Mosaic law? No. God considered clean and unclean animals, basically, it seems, as day one almost. Because it seemed as if Noah knew what he was talking about when he said clean and unclean. You don't see any passages as in Noah was like, what are these animals? I thought all animals were clean, So it was kind of a given. And so this kind of throws out the argument of like, well, we don't have to obey the Mosaic covenant. It was like, well, okay, you don't have to, well, in one regard, even if you didn't obey the Mosaic covenant, this predates the Mosaic covenant. Now, another interesting fact to be said is the Seventh-day Adventists, and I mentioned before, who do live strictly to the kosher laws and other laws in the Mosaic covenant and other stuff, is they have a 7-year longer lifespan than the general population, and a lot of people have cited their diets, in a sense, part of it. And so some say that there's a reason there that you should be very kosher because of that. It's like there's evidence that scientifically showing that if you live by it, you might be able to live longer. Because a lot of the things that affect your health is the way you eat, and obviously how much activity one gets in the day. Now, it was not considered sin, though, whether you followed it or not. The interesting thing is, it seems as there were no punishment or atonement ritual that went along with the breaking of these laws besides being considered unclean until night. That was kind of the thing. It says, well, if you did this, you're not clean, and then you will be clean after. I kind of considered a waiting period to see if anything happened, because you see this along with a lot of other things. If you did something, it's like, okay, if you did this, you're considered unclean till night, and then at that point you are then considered clean again. So there might be some other health things, like concerns, like, okay, wait till night, see if anything happens. If something did happen, okay, you might have gotten sick from something else. Now, the confusion, though, happens when later in the Bible, clean versus unclean kind of became a metaphor for sin and righteousness. And that's where it became difficult to understand a lot of the Old Testament laws properly, because nowadays Christians will think of clean and unclean as sin and righteous, as I just said, and when they'll read a verse in the Old Testament, it's like, oh, it said unclean, so it must be sin. And it's like, well, hold your horses. That's not necessarily true. God is just saying this is unhygienic in a sense. It's not clean. It's not healthy. Just because something isn't healthy doesn't mean it's sin. But a lot of people jump to that conclusion. Now, I get frustrated because of this is not sin. And a lot of atheists or agnostics will make an argument. It's like, well, hey, the Bible says you can't eat clams. And that's dumb. Therefore, the Bible's dumb. And it's like, okay, one, the Bible, yes, says clams are unclean, but not going to eat it anyways. But also, it's not sin. If you really want to, go right ahead. It's not breaking of the law. That's where a lot of times you got to be prepared for these random things that surprisingly atheists do know. They know the most random of laws in the Bible sometimes, and you have to be prepared for that. But it kind of drives me up the wall, because it's just like, you do not know what you're talking about. You have not actually read or studied the Bible. You just heard a verse was there and assumed that it had this specific meaning, which it does not. But that's something people should be prepared for. Now, a passage in Luke says, and as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and sat down to eat. When the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he had not first washed before dinner. So the Pharisees noticed Jesus didn't wash his hands before eating, which was custom. And if you continue reading in the chapter, Jesus went on to rebuke them for being hypocrites in many of ways. But I consider this a very good verse to apply the kosher laws, the dietary laws of the Bible. Because you could say a lot of people would take it as in this verse, in a sense. Jesus didn't wash his hands once before dinner. Therefore, I'm never going to wash my hands again. That's kind of how I feel a lot of people take the kosher laws, in a sense. It's like, hey, this happened. I can eat whatever I want. Well, you can, in one regard, but it's not necessarily healthy. Obviously, if your hands are covered in dirt, you're going to want to wash them off before you eat. That was just kind of not healthy. And so it's something like this, is that, yes, it's a general rule of thumb. You probably should wash your hands. If you don't wash your hands before eating, it's okay. It's not that bad. But at the same time, it's a general cleanliness thing you want to do, especially if you're out in the yard working or something, or getting your hands real dirty. Now, so that kind of brings up to what to do with these laws. I've kind of been giving away what I believe we should do with these laws. Now, as there are obviously a lot of interpretations. And so I believe that, Jesus didn't wash his hands once before eating. It won't be the end of the world if you do, in a sense, eat. But it's still good practice. And that's where it's like, I believe the kosher laws have an application today and should be followed. But at the same time, if you, have bacon occasionally or any of the other non-kosher meats, it is not going to be the end of the world, because it's not sin. But it is, I don't believe God just randomly decided to just name animals unclean for no reason. I think God did things for purpose. I don't think God's, just there to confuse us. He has reasons. But there are other things you can do with these laws, in a sense, is just draw the principle out, clean and unclean. So pursue a life of cleanliness and holiness in everything we do. So kind of going back to that more righteous and side of the words, you could say. I think there are certain elements there that can be followed, but that's kind of the side you can go to is in Psalms 51:10. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right and steadfast spirit within me. We should always be seeking to have a renewed heart, renewed spirit, one seeking after Christ, not seeking ourselves, or seeking sin, but seeking to be holy and righteous. Another verse in 2 Corinthians, it says, therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. So there they have it, in a sense, trying to be in perfecting our holiness in the fear of God, trying to be clean in that sense. Now, just a note, I was going to end the lesson there on just a few of the verses in the New Testament. And there's actually quite a few, but I just want to bring up a couple that are very commonly brought up when you bring up this topic on dietary laws. And I actually kind of was thinking of doing a whole lesson on the hygiene laws first and then doing this, because it kind of makes a lot more sense, because then you have this concept of, there are laws in the Bible that care about your health and well-being in a sense. And so it makes sense to put the dietary laws within that category almost in the Bible. So, but I was kind of pressed for time and I had to come up with a lesson, as I do every week. But so I just want to bring up a couple verses. One in Acts that everyone brings up is that Peter has a dream. It says he fell into a trance and saw heaven open and an object like a great sheet bound at the four corners descending to him and let down to the earth. In it were all kinds of four-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of all of the air. And a voice came to him, rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean. And a voice spoke to him again, and second time, what God has cleansed, you must not call common. So, this verse, everyone basically says, it's official. All meats are clean. God right here deemed them clean because the dream had food in it. So therefore, that's the application. But, interestingly, Peter was vehemently against it. He said, no, never. I've never done this. Why would I start now? And if you think about this on a timetable, this is the book of Acts. This is years after Peter had already spent 3.5 years roughly with Jesus, learning what was righteous and what wasn't, in a sense, what to do in life and what not to do. Jesus was the teacher of them all, So they would have been obeying what Jesus taught them. And so there's an interesting thing there, because that means he didn't eat this even with Jesus. So Jesus didn't eat this. But people do still say, well, it says that, you must not call common what God has cleansed. But if we go based off of only, dreams or other instructions by God, then you could make the same argument with the one here, is that, well, God instructed Abraham to kill his son. So do we interpret that as an instruction to kill our kids? No, this was an analogy. And you see this with what Peter concludes with later in the passage. But I just want to kind of reiterate that, or rehash it, is that God does things to teach us something. May not always seem, clear at first, like the one with Abraham being told kill your son, but he used a test to see if he would follow through with anything. And so the same thing here, this is a lesson for Peter. And the conclusion in the next verse, or a little bit later down, if you keep reading, that's the thing, is a lot of people stop reading and just say, the answer's here. But no, the answer is not there. The answer is a little bit later in the passage in Acts 10:28. Then he said to them, you know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or go to another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. And there we have it. This passage had nothing to do with food. You don't see food in this passage in the context. It's talking about, in a sense, you could almost say racism, and not associating with Gentiles. God said, no, Gentiles are clean. You can hang out with them. You can, they have to be witnessed to somehow. And that's what Peter concluded, because right there in the highlighted text, it says, but God has shown me. He's referring to the vision or dream he had. He's not referring to anything else. It's the dream with the food. And his conclusion was that call any man common or unclean. He didn't mention food. So I think this verse is generally, or this passage in Acts 10, a lot of people just overlook and don't really think about, and they just kind of jump the gun to what they want to hear, in a sense, or want to believe. Don't really give much thought to it. Now, there's another passage a lot of people bring up in Acts 10:28. Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and it is eliminated, thus purifying all foods? ? And he said, what comes out of a man that defiles a man? For from within, out of the heart of a man, proceeds evil thoughts, adulteries, fornication, murders, theft, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All evil things come from within and defile a man. So a lot of people jump to that word that is highlighted, purifying all foods. And they say, look, everything's pure. That means all meats are clean and healthy and righteous to eat. It's okay. But Jesus isn't using the word purify as in a righteousness sense, because he's making a food analogy. He literally is just saying, hey, whatever enters the stomach is eliminated, thus purifying all foods. In a sense, he's talking about the actual process of digestion. He says food goes in, your stomach will digest it, and then your colon will extract any, nutrients out of it, and anything else is waste. And it says that is what comes out of a man, it says, defiles a man. And so he's kind of making almost an analogy there. It's like, that's what's considered waste, what comes out, the actual waste, and then gives an analogy to the wickedness that comes out of a man, in a sense. The same says, just like the food is purified, quote unquote, excreted. I think that's really what this verse is talking about, and not so much this concept that a lot of people are initially thinking of, oh, it's purity, in a sense, righteous. No, that in context, it doesn't make sense in that as much. It makes more sense of actual in purging. And I actually did, I read this verse a few times. I'm like, something seems off. And I was trying to look at the Greek and to see what was there. And it brought up the root word that was there does kind of give this more of this purging sense. Now, or it even makes sense with the word purifying, even in English, though. If you look at the actual definition, it says, separate, unmix, in a sense, to make whole, as in one. And so it does make sense in a literal sense of purifying. But a lot of people are taking it spiritually, even though to me it makes no sense to actually take this verse, at least within that word, spiritually. I think a lot of people are trying too hard to justify different foods. Now, an interesting thing in this passage, though, too, because he was eating, and they were talking about, whether something is clean or unclean, but what they were considering unclean was something kosher. Jesus, remember, was eating kosher meat, and so that was a debate. It wasn't even over an unclean meat, because the Jews, they wouldn't even considered it food to eat to begin with, and so they weren't debating over non-kosher foods. They were debating kosher foods that got dirty from some other practice. So there's just some interesting things to think about there. Now, lastly, just wanted to kind of end on this verse. Romans 14:3, let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. So I know there is a heated debate among some whether you should keep kosher or you shouldn't. And the Bible is fairly clear that you should not despise one another, consider one holier than one another if you do or you don't. It's kind of up to the discretion of the person. If that's what you want to do, then go right ahead. If you don't want to and you want to eat the pork and whatnot, go right ahead. It's just God has considered it unhealthy, as I would say. I think is a better word to use, what is clean or unclean. So kind of with that, those are some topics to think about. Very interesting. Probably won't hear it like that in any other place. But thanks for tuning in and listening to this week's lesson. Hopefully, see you guys next week. I'm not quite sure what next week's lesson will be, but we'll see. With that, God bless.